Yeah, sure. We can have Susan next time. That would be great. Thanks for all you Squidwards of many different emotions and levels of fatigue for coming to class. I wanted to check first, just super briefly, if there's any administrative questions. I'm going to take questions about the final paper at the end of class today because you'll be getting your instructions. But we only have 3 weeks left, so we're almost there. You guys are doing it. Yeah, just let me know. So today we're actually going to start, I don't know if you remember way back when we were talking about Freud, and people had some different questions about the specific case, which involved a kind of sexual assault of Dora. Maybe you guys remember. So I went and reached out to Khadija, who today is going to have just a little presentation and a bit of information for us in general and about Vanier. So I'd like to thank Khadija for coming to join us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So can I start, Emily? Yeah, okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Emily, can you see it?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. So thank you all so much for having me here and for your interest in this topic, because it's a very important topic. So I'm going to briefly do a short presentation on consent and sexual violence, and then we'll have a period for questions if you have any. But please feel free to use the raise hand function at any point during the presentation. If you want to ask a question or comment on a specific section, you don't necessarily need to wait till the end of the presentation. I do not mind at all. Okay. So my name is Khadija Campbell, and I am the Social Service Officer for Sexual Violence Prevention and Response in Student Services. I am new to the role, and I'm also new to Vanier. I started in January. And prior to that, I was working at a shelter for survivors of intimate partner violence. So kind of within the same field, just in a community organization. So the one-stop service, as you can see on this slide, that is my office. And essentially what I do within my role is I am a person who can support anyone who has been impacted by sexual violence. So whether that be a survivor victim or a witness of sexual violence. I am also in charge of overseeing the mandatory trainings on sexual violence. For those of you who do not know, Law 151 requires that all higher educational institutions implement mandatory trainings on sexual violence for all student body, but as well for staff and faculty. So at one point you will be receiving the training. You as well, Emily. So in terms of the one-stop service, it's called the one-stop service because you can go to this service for multiple different types of supports that you might need. So in terms of disclosures, if you are a survivor victim and you want to just disclose an experience of sexual violence, you can come to the one-stop service for that. And it's really based on your needs. So whatever you want to do, if you just want somebody to listen to you, if you just want to get it off your chest, that's no problem. We don't force anything upon you. You can also report. So if you witnessed sexual assault on campus, I know not many people are on campus, but if it happened in the past or in the future, you can also come and explain that you have witnessed sexual assault or sexual violence. And also for any type of formal complaints, if that's the route that you want to take, you can come and make a formal complaint. For any type of information, you can come and speak to the one-stop service. So really just understanding what sexual violence is. I also provide help or support for people who really are in a dating violent relationship or want to know more about unhealthy versus healthy relationships. In terms of support, I can provide referrals for external support, internal support as well. Accommodation, so if there's any academic accommodation in your classrooms, navigating situations that might consist of sexual violence, or if you're not sure if they consist of sexual violence, we can have a conversation about that. And lastly, I am an advocate for survivor victims of sexual violence. Apart from that, another resource at Vanning is the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Policy. So I'm not sure how many of you know about this policy or if you've read it, but you can find it on the Vanning website, and it really gives you a detailed understanding of how Vanning aims to prevent and respond to sexual violence. I also want to specify that I am there to support students who have experienced sexual violence, but it doesn't need to be that you've experienced sexual violence on campus. It could be an experience of sexual violence outside of campus as well, or with somebody who is not a Vanning student as well. Just wanted to make that little point. Okay. So just a little disclaimer before we start, the topic can be triggering for many different reasons, depending on the person. So it's very important that you listen to yourselves and you know your limits. If ever you feel like you're getting overwhelmed, please listen to that feeling. It is a valid feeling. Step away, take a break, and come back to us when you feel more ready. It's normal to feel uncomfortable when speaking about sexual violence. It is a normal feeling that everybody has, but I feel like the more we speak about it, the less discomfort we feel. If ever you need to reach out to me after this presentation, I will be available, or you can reach out to somebody else that you may trust if you feel the need. I want to make a little point on the terminology that will be used. So I will be using perpetrator when I'm speaking about concrete examples when it's an actual case. So if I'm speaking about hypothetical examples, it'll be respondent. If I'm speaking about a concrete example, it'll be perpetrator. And in terms of the survivor victim or complainant, so we use survivor victim because some people associate more with that term, identify more with that term, so survivor, and some people identify more with the term a victim. So we kind of like to put them both together to allow the person to choose what they feel most comfortable identifying with. And we might also see the word complainant as well. So that's a person making the complaint. Okay, so what is sexual violence? So sexual violence is any physical or psychological behavior that is carried out through sexual means or by targeting sexuality. Okay, so sexual violence is really the umbrella term. And then under that, we have sexual assault and we have sexual harassment. So one thing to keep in mind when we speak about sexual violence, one, it always targets sexuality, and two, it's always non-consensual. So sexual assault is unwanted and non-consensual contact of a sexual nature. This is a crime. So it is in the criminal code that it is a crime. And it involves any type of physical contact that is non-consensual. So it could be anything from groping, grabbing, rape, touching, etc., etc. And then when we look at sexual harassment, it is unwanted behavior that targets someone's sexuality. And most often than not, it is without physical contact. So sexual harassment is not a crime in the criminal code, but there are two types of behavior that are crimes. Sorry. So sharing intimate images of another person is a crime, as well as stalking, that is criminal harassment. Other types of behavior that falls under sexual assault could be making jokes about that target someone's sexuality or someone's sexual orientation. It could be asking someone constantly for sexual favors or on dates. It could also include unnecessary physical contact. So that's the part that says most often than not without physical contact. So in cases like this, it could be a colleague of yours, let's say, who comes and kind of rubs your shoulders or kind of pats your arm or gives you like a little massage, that could be sexual harassment as well. In terms of sexual harassment, depending on where you find yourself, so at Vanney, of course, we have a policy and we have no tolerance for sexual harassment. In your workplace as well, they for sure have a policy dealing with that as well. In terms of the law, like I said, it is not a crime in many of the instances, but you can also file a complaint under the Commission des droits de la personne because it is prohibited under the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. So if ever you're in a situation where you're being sexually harassed and you know that you can't go to the police, you can file the complaint under the Commission des droits de la personne. Okay, so now I wanted to do a bit of myth busting because there are a lot of myths surrounding sexual violence. So kind of just, and it'll also give us kind of more of more information on that topic and on consent as we're doing the myth busting. So just give me a second here. So people are often assaulted by someone they do not know, which can be called stranger danger. Come on. So this is false. There are 80% of people who are sexually assaulted know the person who assaulted them. And more often than not, it occurs in a place of residence, in a vehicle, in an institutional setting. Seeing as we often know the person who assaulted us, this could mean that sexual assault can occur within the context of a romantic relationship. So whether that be a marriage or if you're just in a dating relationship with someone, it can occur. Just because you're in a relationship with a person does not mean that your rights have been taken away from you. And it does not mean that you can't refuse sexual activity if you're not in the mood or if you just don't want to, or if you're not comfortable with it. Number 2, men do not experience sexual violence. So once again, this is false. 1 in 6 men experience sexual violence, and about 1.5, maybe to 2% of men have been sexually assaulted. Of course, these numbers don't show the full picture because there's a lot of reasons why men wouldn't come forward and disclose that they have been sexually assaulted. There are a lack of resources for men in the community, and also the fact that we often believe that men are bigger, they're stronger, so they can't be sexually assaulted. It makes men less likely to come forward because they feel like they won't be believed or that they'll be ridiculed. Nonetheless, the numbers for women are higher. Women are more often than not the survivor victims of sexual violence. So 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual violence, and around 20% of women have been sexually assaulted. Between the ages of 15 and 24, those are like the ages that are most often targeted. So that it happens to everyone across all ages, but the statistics show that between the ages of 15 and 24, that's more of a vulnerable period. Emily, you raised your hand.
Hi, there's just a question in the chat that I wanted to make sure came out,
okay.
Which one of the students asked, is it possible that men are not taken serious when they report it to the authorities? I think it's possible. I was gonna
You said if it's possible, actually I can read it, that men aren't taken seriously? Is that what it? Possible men aren't taken seriously? Yeah, absolutely.
When they do report it.
Absolutely. And that falls under the line of, that's what, when I refer to, we often think that men are not sexually assaulted because more often than not, they're stronger, they're bigger. So how can someone else sexually assault them? But this is not true. They can be sexually assaulted as well. And they are not taken seriously. Sometimes they can be, but more often than not, they are not taken seriously. Emily, do you mind just continuing looking at the chat for the questions, please? Because I'm not paying attention.
Yes, of course.
Perfect. Thank you.
Of course, no problem.
Okay. So other groups who are more at risk. So transgender people. So there's 1 in 2 transgender people who will experience sexual violence in their lifetime, which is very, very high. The LGBTQ community, women with disabilities, and racialized women. A lot of these groups are experience it at a higher risk because they have intersecting marginalized identities that intersect and that affect their experience. So this is called intersectionality. So an example of this would be a person of color, a trans person of color. So on one hand, the person might experience transphobia, and on another hand, they might experience racism. So these two experiences intersect and they affect a person's experience, and they put them more at risk of experiencing sexual violence. There are a lot of other different types of intersectionalities and identities, but that's just one example. And just to keep in mind, there are a lot of people who are more vulnerable because of this. Emily, is that your new hand or your old hand? Okay.
Sorry, that was an old hand.
No problem. So if a person dresses in a revealing way, it means that they are asking for it or giving their consent for any type of sexual activity. Of course, this is false. So a person has the right to dress in whatever way that they want, and it does not mean that it's an invitation for sexual activity to occur. When we focus on what the survivor victim was doing, we're often engaging in victim blaming, whether that be done intentionally or unintentionally. We should be rather focusing on what the perpetrator did and their own behaviors and why they took advantage of the other person. So each person is responsible for their own behavior. So if you're presented with a situation, you are able to decide what you want to do. You have many options, and if you decide to cross another person's boundaries and act in a harmful way, that is your responsibility. You have to take responsibility for those actions and assume the consequences. And feeling provoked is not a valid excuse for sexual violence or any type of violence at all. So women, this is a very interesting one. Women often denounce experiencing sexual violence without reason, false reporting. So of course, once again, this is false. False reporting only, in terms of sexual violence, it only occurs in 2 to 4% of, there are only 2 to 4% of cases that are false reporting. And there's no more, it's not more common than any other type of false reporting when it comes to any other crimes. And we often have this belief that in terms of like gender-based violence, so if it's intimate partner violence or sexual violence, that it's more common that you will find false reporting cases, but that's actually the contrary. And in terms of, yes, Emily.
It's a bit on the last point, but someone asked, is there a dress code to follow at Vanier, which I was just looking up? Like girls can't wear crop tops or tank tops because that would relate to women have to hide to not be bothered by men.
That's a good question. I haven't seen anything like that. Did you look it up just now, Emily?
My Google shows like code of conduct. Let me see. This is a code of conduct from 2016. This is what I found on Google.
It's being revised currently, so.
What does it say? Okay, it doesn't say anything about, actually it doesn't say anything about like space and coverage. I'm gonna just post it in the chat in case people are interested.
Okay.
It says like appropriate attire and no offensive things and safe things. That's pretty good as dress codes go, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything that actually says about like wearing revealing clothing, and I think it would go against exactly what the environment that we're striving to create. Because once again, as we said, whatever clothing you might wear, it's not an invitation for anyone to act a certain way with you and to cross your boundaries. And just to keep in mind that the code of conduct is being revised. So I know it says 2016, but that should be like, there should be the revision, sorry, should be done by the end of the year. Okay, so there are many reasons why a person would not disclose having experienced sexual violence. And actually, there's only 1 out of 20 cases of sexual assault that are reported, which is quite low. There are a lot of negative feelings that might come into play. So a person who has experienced sexual violence might feel ashamed. They might feel guilty, humiliated, embarrassed. And one of the reasons is because sexuality is something that is not openly spoken about within our society, which poses another barrier to coming forward and disclosing that they have been sexually assaulted. We often engage in victim blaming, as we spoke about a bit about earlier. So survivor victims might feel like if they come forward with it, they might not be believed. They might be blamed. So questions such as, what were you wearing? It could be questions such as, did you fight back? Did you say no? Why are you coming forward only now when it happened years ago? Wouldn't you want to have addressed it right away? So those questions, whether they're intentional or non-intentional, it kind of puts too much of the focus on the behavior of the survivor victim rather than focusing on what happened to them and the harmful behaviors that the other person was displaying. Another barrier is that they might fear for their safety. So fear for their safety of themselves, but also of their loved ones. So if they come forward and the perpetrator finds out about it, it might escalate the situation. So that could be a fear that the survivor victim might have, which might make them not come forward. And finally, feeling conflicted about the perpetrator. So we had discussed earlier that a lot of survivor victims know the perpetrator of the violence. So it could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a teacher. So knowing the person poses a barrier because you could have a certain relationship of trust with the person. You could have, like if it's a family member, it could be somebody that you cared for and you might not want to get them in trouble. So there might be a lot of conflictual feelings present there. So all in all, false reporting, the rates of false reporting are very low, and quite the opposite, people do not come forward often with sexual assault. Okay, so sexual assault is not a calculated act. It often happens in the spur of the moment. So this is false. Sexual assault is, in fact, a calculated act. Most sexual assaults are premeditated and they involve planning, coercion, force, or threats of some kind. We often think that sexual assault occurs for sexual gratification, but it's quite the opposite. It occurs because of a need for power and control over someone else. And when we think about it, when they occur, they often occur in places that are, less populated, that you'll be able to get away with the act. You're more likely to get away with the act. So keeping that in mind, it means that the person is taking into account where they're going to assault the other person. So we can see that it is something that is planned out prior to committing the act. I believe that is the last question. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the next section? We're good. Okay. Okay, so consent, what is it? So the definition of consent is voluntary agreement for something to happen, for sexual activity to happen. So in terms of consent, it has to be informed. So both parties need to know what they are consenting to, and there should not be any lies or trickery. So an example of non-informed consent would be at the beginning, before engaging in any type of sexual activity, you both agree that you're going to use a condom. Right when you're supposed to use the condom, the other person decides that they don't want to and they engage in the sexual activity. So that is not informed consent. Another thing that I will address a bit later, but I'll bring it up because it falls within this point as well, is if you have HIV, if you are HIV positive and you know that there's a risk of transmission to the other person and you do not tell them, that also is considered as not informed consent, and it also can be a crime as well. So consent is reversible. So a person can change their mind at any point in time during the sexual activity. So if you say yes at the beginning and you decide halfway through or even 2 minutes later that you're not comfortable with what's going on, you're allowed to say yes, and the other person must respect that as well. Consent is freely given, so it should not be given as a result of pressure, threats, or fear. It should be voluntary. So if a person says, do this or else, that is not, and you say yes to it, your consent is not valid. Enthusiastic. So enthusiastic consent means being eager and excited. It's saying yes and also showing yes in your body language as well. And it's not being reluctant. So if a person says yes, but you can tell that they're rigid, you can tell that they're uncomfortable, you should stop right away and check in with the person because they have not given you enthusiastic consent. Finally, it is specific. So saying yes to one thing does not mean you're agreeing to other things. So you might have said yes to kissing. It does not mean that you have said yes to having sex, and you must ask for consent at every step of the way. So here I have a little slide on ways of not giving consent. So I'm way too drunk, either saying it, or if you see a person is really slurring their words, they can't stand straight, their eyes are closing, they cannot give you consent. I don't feel comfortable, stop, not tonight, I'm not ready, giggling. Often giggling, I've spoken to a few people who are a bit confused about this one, but giggling can be a sign of discomfort. So if somebody does giggle after you ask them for consent, it's not a yes. I would suggest stopping and checking in with the person. So maybe later, can we take it slow? I'm not sure. Having said yes in the past, silence is not a yes. It's never a yes. I'm not in the mood tonight. No, I guess, being unconscious, and I changed my mind. So once again, if you are in any of these situations, or if you receive any of these words, you have not received consent. So now I wanted to just address a bit about what the law states. So as we had discussed earlier, sexual assault is a crime, but there's no time limit for making a complaint of sexual assault to the police. So whether you have been sexually assaulted a month ago, 5 years ago, 10, 20 years ago, you can always go to the police and make a complaint of sexual assault. And it doesn't need to just be the survivor victim who makes a complaint. If anyone knows about a sexual assault, they can file a report as well. In terms of the age of consent, anyone under the age of 12 cannot consent to any sexual activity, so it's never valid. If you are 12 or 13 years old, the other person cannot be more than 2 years older than you. So they can't be more than, if you're 12, they can't be older than 14. If you're 13, they can't be older than 15. If you are 14 or 15 years old, they can't be more than 5 years older than you. In Canada, the legal age of consent is 16 years old, but there's one case that there's one exception. So teens under the age of 18 cannot give consent if there's an imbalance in the relationship. What does this mean? So an imbalance in the relationship occurs when one person is in a vulnerable position compared to the other person. So, for example, a teacher-student relationship, a coach-athlete relationship, boss-employee, supervisor-employee, etc. So the law says that if that person who's in the vulnerable position and is under 18 years old, they cannot give their consent, and it is considered sexual assault. So in some cases, if a person says yes, sexual assault is still not legal. Sexual consent is still not legal. So consent was not given freely. For example, if the person was threatened. So we addressed that earlier. Consent was not informed. For example, if the person lied and could cause serious risk of harm to the other person. So that's the case of a person who might have HIV. This can also be if the person said yes to using contraceptives and they did not, and there's a risk of pregnancy, the consent was not informed, which means that it was not legal as well. So the person was not able to consent because they were unconscious or they were too drunk, or if the person was too young. So in these 4 cases, consent, even though the person said yes, is not legal. Emily?
Yeah, so there's a couple different questions here. So there's one.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. One question about reporting, like what happens if, I think a question is something like how would you prove that it's real if someone accuses you, or if the person who had assaulted you denies it? And then there's a private message I got from someone asking about what if you want to make a complaint and the perpetrator is dead.
Oh, okay. So the first question is how to prove that it's real. Is that it?
I think it's like what happens. Tell me if I'm saying it wrong, Maya. You can also jump in. But like, what would happen with? Is it possible the person who's assaulting denies that they did the assault, and that they would say it's not real? That's how I'm reading it.
I think that often happens, actually. They do take a lot of factors into consideration. One of the things that I know that is not a defense is if the respondent or the alleged perpetrator says, it's not a defense to just say, I thought I got consent from the other person. That does not hold up. They have to show that they took all the measures to ensure that they received consent. If they're not able to, then consent was not received. In terms of the specific actions that they would have to evaluate, I couldn't tell you that specifically because I know it goes case by case, but they do really see, like, was it informed? Was it freely given? Also, they see if there are any witnesses that could attest to what happened. Was the person unconscious? Were they blacked out, drunk, or intoxicated, etc., etc.? Maya?
Yeah, so I'm the one that asked the question because sometimes I see on the news and I see like these celebrities and they have like a lot of money, and it's like oh, complaint made after like 20 years,
and it's like person, sorry, what?
Like complaint made after 20 years, and then the person that has money has to like give them money in return for like the assault. So sometimes I feel like, oh yeah, like it's legit, like, oh, the person got assaulted, but sometimes I feel like, oh, maybe it's like a question of like money.
So in terms of sexual assault, you can go the criminal route, but you can also go the civil route. So criminal is really like you're pressing charges for what has been done and it's a crime. The civil route is if you're trying to get like a certain compensation out of the person who has assaulted you. So in terms of the celebrities, I guess maybe they're going the civil route. I couldn't say for sure. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it's that answers.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The second question was if the person had passed away, correct?
Yeah, and you wanted to make a complaint in some way.
Honestly, I have never thought about that, and that is an excellent question that I will write down and look into. Do you happen to know the answer for that, Emily?
Oh, I don't either, actually. That's also no one I'd come across. So I'm curious, but I don't know. I wonder what kind of options there would be.
I guess in terms of the criminal charges, nothing could be done because the person is no longer there. But maybe there might be if you do the civil route, there might be some sort of compensation that you can get. But I don't know that for sure. I will definitely look into that. That is a great question.
And then while we were discussing these two, there's been a whole exchange in the chat about like, oh my God, wait, do I need to like get everybody's consent every step of the, how do I record them? How do I make sure that I got their consent? How am I going to like have sex and it be okay? There's these kinds of questions popping up.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of look through it. In terms of the proof, because I see a lot of how do we prove? In terms of the proof, I don't. It's difficult because when it happens, it's usually in like, let's say, a place of residence between two people, you know? So it's really, they take what one person says and what the other person says and the circumstantial evidence and kind of see what was more likely to happen. They take a lot into consideration. I couldn't tell you exactly what or how the process works, but one thing to keep in mind is constantly checking in with the person. And you don't need to do it in a way that like will make them, or I think a lot of people think that asking or checking in will kill the mood. But when you check in with the person and you see what they're comfortable with, that just makes everything more pleasurable because both parties feel comfortable. It's very, very, very important to also read body language. So if you can tell that a person is uncomfortable, most of us can tell when someone's uncomfortable. If you can tell that they're a bit more rigid, they're kind of backing away or pushing away, always take that as a no. It shouldn't be something like, if you're not sure, it should always be a no. So check in with the person. And even if you check in and you see, and they say that they're comfortable, but you still see that they're not, I would really suggest to just stop. And maybe at a later point, they'll be more comfortable. When you open the topic again and you have a conversation about it, they will be more comfortable. Saying no, or just because you're stopping the sexual activity in the moment, doesn't mean that it might not occur. So there might be other opportunities for you to occur and the person might feel more comfortable, which will make the sexual activity more pleasurable for everyone. Was there anything else? A contract. The thing with a contract, and a lot of people have brought that up, is that because consent is reversible, the contract kind of it wouldn't be valid. It wouldn't work. Because if you say, yes, I consent to this, that, and then you're in the moment, you can change your mind. So the contract kind of just, it doesn't hold up at that point. Okay, oops. refresh on that. Yes, I did. Okay. Maya, that was your old hand, correct?
Yeah, I'm gonna remove it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, in Canada, publishing, texting, or sharing intimate pictures of someone without their consent is a crime. So that is sexual harassment, and one of the forms that is in the criminal code. And stalking as well is a form of criminal harassment. There is a protection for people who have reasonable fears. It's called Section 810 Peace Bond. So if a person is afraid of someone else, even if there has been no crime that has been committed. So if the person was not sexually assaulted, they've probably just been sexually harassed, but they're afraid of the person and they're afraid that they might harm themselves, their family, damage their property, or share or publish an intimate image. You can go to the courthouse and ask the judge for a peace bond, which will it's kind of like a contract that the other person will have that says that they cannot disturb the peace, so that they have to follow certain restrictions. They can't come in a certain contact with you around your workplace. If you have kids, they can't go in contact with the kids, etc., etc. So this is a good way of protecting yourself when it comes to cases of sexual harassment and when you can't necessarily press charges against someone. So it is a crime to secretly watch, photograph, or film a person in a situation in which they have the right to privacy. So let's say that they're in a house, in their apartment, their house, and you're photographing them. This is called voyeurism, and it is a crime. And it's really a case when somebody is fully or partially naked, and where they're in a place where they're most likely to be in this situation. So it could be in a changing room at a store. If you climb over the little rooms and you're watching them, this is a crime. So one great thing about the Quebec law is that they let you end your lease if your safety, or the safety of, if you have children, the safety of your child living with you is threatened by spousal, but we'll say also any type of dating, intimate partner relationship, or sexual violence. So if you're living with a partner who is being abusive, whether that be sexually, physically, emotionally, you can ask your landlord to end the lease before the lease is up. You have to, although, fill out a form, bring it to the courthouse. It is a process, but the landlord cannot refuse to take your name off the lease. Although you might have to pay like 1 or 2 months depending on the situation, but you have the right to be taken off the lease on those grounds. Last but not least, indecent acts. Carrying out an indecent act in a public place in front of other people is forbidden. So it is a crime if a person shows their genitals in public. Do we have any questions on this? I'm at the last section.
There's actually a question about like being naked at your window, if that's kind of like an indecent act as well, because others didn't consent. I'm not sure. I think it would, maybe you're naked at your window, but you like live in a very empty area and nobody ever walks by.
Yeah. I don't think it would be, just because it's not in public. Let's say you're naked at your window and somebody, like if you have neighbors right in front and they're taking pictures of you, then that is a crime. But if you're just walking by your window naked, I don't think it's considered to be an indecent act. Is there anything else? you reading the
Yeah, I'm looking at Alex. Did you have a specific question associated with the story, or like what kind of connection were you making? Maybe you can say.
a good example of voyeurism? Watch you, exactly. That's true. Okay, so I will move on to the last slide. Okay, so in terms of external resources, here is a list of resources. There are many others. I just picked a few different resources that can help in terms of sexual violence. So there's a Montreal Sexual Assault Center, which is free services for survivor victims of sexual assault. They can also provide support for if you have a loved one who has experienced sexual assault, they can provide support for yourself as well. And there is a 24/7 helpline that you can call if ever you need to speak to someone. There is CALAX, which is a service for only women and teen girls who have been sexually assaulted. It's free of charge as well, and they provide quite a lot of services, accompaniments, referrals, counseling, etc., etc. CAVAC, which is a service for survivor victims of any crime. It's not just sexual assault. Usually when you file a police report, often they will give your name and your contact info to CAVAC, and CAVAC will contact you. They can walk you through the judicial process and give you referrals to any sort of services that might be best to support you. There's also IVAC, which is they offer compensation for victims of criminal acts. So if there's any type of physical or psychological injury, they can offer you compensation. What they also do is sometimes they can cover your moving expenses in certain situations. They can set up an alarm system in your house. So let's say you are a survivor of intimate partner violence. They can set up an alarm system in your new place, in your new apartment or place of residence. And they also offer free, up until a certain amount, but free sessions with a mental health professional as well. SOS Violence Conjugale, so SOS Conjugal Violence, is a line that you can call if you are in a violent relationship. It could be family violence as well as dating violence. They're a dispatch line that they might dispatch your call to a shelter, and they can provide support if you need to be sheltered, one, or if you just need active listening. They also have a list of external centers. So external centers are centers that are specialized in intimate partner violence, but that you don't need to be sheltered. So there's the shelter piece, but there's the external center. So SOS Violence Conjugale can really, if you explain your situation, they can refer you to the best resource. There is the McGill Domestic Violence Clinic, which it's a clinic for both perpetrators and for victims. So if you need help controlling your anger, if you've crossed boundaries multiple times and you feel like you need to work on that, then you can consult with them. Or if you are a victim of intimate partner violence, you can consult with them as well. Educalois is an amazing website that explains the law by topic, but in a very simple way. Like you can easily understand it compared to if you Google like the criminal code and sections of the criminal code, they use such complicated terms that I can't understand, but Educalois kind of breaks it down for you. Finally, there's Interligne, which provides help to those concerned with sexual and gender diversity, and you can call or text this line as well. Emily.
There's just a question in the chat. I've asked for clarification about whether it's about like resources or phone lines or more about the process. But a student is asking if it's one of your parents who is being abusive and you love them, so you don't want to report them, like what are your options?
So if your parents are being abusive towards you, um, you can still call SOS Violence Conjugale, and you can tell them that it's to do with family violence. And they will refer you to, there's certain shelters and external centers that are specialized in family violence, and you can kind of consult with a psychosocial worker. And I think right now everything's being done online, but you can meet with them online and they can support you through what you're going through and kind of lay out the options that you have. Of course, if you're under 17, that's when youth protection would get involved, because you're still a minor. So if ever that's a route that you want to take, you can call youth protection as well, kind of on yourself. So yeah. Is that it? Well, that's the end of my presentation. So I'll give you a few minutes if you have any questions that you, or things that you wanted me to address that you want to bring up, feel free. Just gonna look through the chat. No questions? Okay, well, that concludes my my presentation. Thank you all so much for your participation, for your questions. You brought up some questions that I have to look into that I've never even thought about. It's definitely a learning process every time I give these presentations as well. And it's skills building when we're talking about consent, boundary setting, sexual violence. We all always have something to learn. And as we grow as humans in our personal lives, we always have to keep reflecting on these topics as well. Thank you so much for your interest. And I know it might not seem like a lot, but you have contributed to cultivating a culture of consent on and off campus by just being here. Emily?
Great. So thank you so much, everybody. If you want to throw your thanks in the chat or put the little clapping hands on. That's super awesome, Khadija. So much good information. And I also have Khadijah's information. If any of you want to get in touch and afterwards, you can ask me and I'll ferry you right over.
Absolutely. I'm relatively quick to respond. So Mayo or email, that works fine with me. So
great. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your class.
Sounds good. All right, everybody. So I was going to propose that we use this time to take our 5-minute break that we habitually take. Because I just don't want your eyeballs to burn out completely. So I'm gonna find us some kind of 5-minute break chill music. And we're back. Let's get out of this thing. The sun is in my eyes. So that was a little bit longer than I had planned for the presentation. So we're probably not going to get through everything that I had planned today. We'll put half of it over onto next week. So I'll put the piece on cognitive behavioral therapy onto next week. If you decide you want to write about it for the final paper, don't freak out. We'll talk about it next week. But you could just as easily write about a treatment method we have already discussed. So what I'll do today, instead of these things, we're going to take those out. So today we're basically going to start discussing the treatment methods in our contemporary worldview about mental health and mental illness. And there's two main ones. So they are, on the one hand, psychopharmaceuticals, which means psych-altering drugs, psychologically effective drugs, and talk therapy. In particular, what we'll talk about next time is called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a particular way of dealing with your thoughts that has become the most affordable and accessible form of therapy for many people. So we're going to talk just today about psychopharmaceuticals. And before we get there, we're going to talk about a little bit about the origin of starting to use psychiatric medication. So you had a little bit on this in the video last time. So remember like 2 weeks ago, we talked about that big Bible, a big psychiatry Bible called the DSM. We talked about getting a diagnosis. You get a diagnosis, you're excited, like Rebecca. What do you do now? Largely, right, if you get a diagnosis today, you'll go down one of these two routes. And for many people, the use of medication is the first kind of line of attack. Or the other way I've seen it put is, okay, like we can get you therapy, but we need to get you to a baseline before you're able to do therapy. So we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of tenuous relationship that our society has to this medication, which we find useful, but which doesn't itself explain mental illness. So a particular kind of folk theory or like phrasing that you'll hear around this about the cause of mental illness, right, is that it's due to chemical imbalances in the brain. And it's usually neurotransmitters, right? So sometimes it's that people with depression have low serotonin. That's called the serotonin hypothesis. And they started to study this in the 60s. But they make conclusions about other mental illnesses as well. So in the 50s and 60s, they started developing these medications first that they noticed raised or lowered a certain level of neurotransmitter in the brain. And this prompted them to think, okay, what if this level, this chemical level, is itself what's causing depression or schizophrenia or anxiety disorder? And this is called the chemical imbalance theory. And it's as close to what Saz would have called a brain disease as anything, right? So this would have been developing right when he's starting to write about the myth of mental illness, right? Challenging brain disease. So a chemical imbalance where it's either too little of something or too much of another thing. And then you go, okay, if the problem is low serotonin, and these drugs help me get more serotonin, then that should cancel out in some way the depression, right? That should be able to cure it. If it's only caused by low serotonin, if the low serotonin is a side effect of something else, right, then what we're doing is we're actually just treating a symptom. But the chemical imbalance hypothesis says mental illnesses are just chemical imbalances. And this is pretty common kind of discourse, of way of speaking about mental illness for a few reasons, right? It kind of, for some reason, it's interesting to wonder why, right? But when it's made into just a brain disease or just a completely physical matter, people tend to feel relieved or less shameful or be less judgmental, right? When they make that analogy. So there's certain payoffs, but actually since the 60s, there have been numerous different kinds of experiments that have shown that this really simple chemical imbalance theory is false. So it might be the fact that neurotransmitter levels are side effects or that they're combined with something electrical in the brain. But we do know, and we've known since the 80s, despite this kind of folk myth, that it's not a simple chemical imbalance. So we're gonna watch just the first 5 minutes of this video. I found this old guy. He talks a little bit about how it arose. And you have the link for it, so if you want to watch the following like 15 minutes, he takes you through specific papers to sort of show his point. But for now, we'll just watch a few minutes. I'll stop my video. Please tell me if the connection sucks, blah, 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 blah.
In the brain, you'll really want to hear what these leading scientific finding a detailed look at the chemical imbalance theory, which says that mental disorders are caused by chemical imbalances in the brain and that psychiatric medications correct those imbalances. First, we'll briefly go through the history of the chemical imbalance theory, and then we'll look at the scientific findings of a number of today's leading psychiatric researchers. If you believe, like 85% of the general public, that mental disorders are most likely caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, you'll really want to hear what these leading researchers have to say about it. It'll open the door to better outcomes for you and anyone you know. Okay, let's get started. Keep in mind, this video is geared for the general public. Some of you will be familiar with the terminology being used, and some won't. So as we go through this, I'll be explaining some things from time to time and try and make sure everybody who's watching can understand what's being said. Now, first, it's important you have a little history on the chemical imbalance theory to put things into context. The theory first started to gain popularity in the 1960s. It's based on the idea that mental disorders are caused by either too much or too little of certain chemicals in the brain called neurotransmitters. The main ones are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. For example, most of us have heard the story that depression is caused by low serotonin in the brain. Throughout the 1960s, more was learned about the effects that psychiatric medications had on the brain and also about neurotransmitters in general. Toward the end of the 1960s, the chemical imbalance theory stirred up the hope that we had about what causes mental disorders and also how to cure them using psychiatric medications. So in the late 60s, the psychiatric research community set out in earnest to prove that the chemical imbalance theory was indeed true. And for about 15 years, from the late 60s to the early 80s, at least 100 major research studies were done trying to prove the chemical imbalance theory. Many of these studies were called monoamine depletion studies. Now, for those of you not familiar with neurotransmitters, they're divided into groups like peptides, amino acids, and monoamines. The main neurotransmitters having to do with the chemical imbalance theory, including serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, are in the monoamine group. The hypothesis of the monoamine depletion studies is simple. If people are depressed because the serotonin in their brain is low, if you took a person who's never had to deal with depression and dramatically reduce the amount of serotonin in their brain, they should get depressed. And in the many, many monoamine depletion studies done, not one normal person got depressed when the serotonin in their brain was dramatically reduced. These monoamine depletion studies and a number of other types of studies that also had negative outcomes pretty much knocked the wind out of the chemical imbalance theory. And finally, in 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health, which is the largest and most prestigious mental health research organization in the world, published this finding in the American Journal of Psychiatry. They concluded that elevations or decrements in the functions of serotonergic systems are not likely to be associated with depression. And even in the late 80s, when the introduction of Prozac gave the theory some new life, by the end of the 1990s, the new research only confirmed these original findings were indeed correct. From that point forward, the psychiatric research community left behind the chemical imbalance theory and moved on to other possibilities. Now, I know for some of you, that fact might be hard to believe, seeing how today about 85...
Okay, I'm gonna stop it here. He just goes on to take you through like 3 or 4 specific sources. So if you're interested, you can look up that and watch the end of it on your own time. I did, it's fascinating. So the basic story is, we know there's something going on in the brain that has to do with mental and emotional distress, but it's not this simple chemical imbalance. And when we think it's a simple chemical imbalance, then it's easy to think that, well, you just add or subtract the necessary chemicals and you get a happy patient. So I think, as I said before, that even though it is itself somewhat of a myth, the chemical imbalance theory has certain kinds of emotional benefits, right? It's kind of nice for some whatever reason, right? Once we are able to make something a physical, measurable disease, we tend to attach less guilt or shame to it, right? It might even, right, for example, say you had a very tumultuous childhood. Maybe you're attracted to the chemical imbalance theory because it helps you not to think about your childhood. So we had the chemical imbalance theory, right, rising and popular in the 60s, and it really helped begin these developments of psychopharmaceuticals. You don't have to memorize this list. This is so that you can get an idea of the breadth and type of medications that we use to affect our moods and thinking. So generally across the board, they treat symptoms, so that you have antidepressants who treat, right, the lowered amount of serotonin. We have had different kinds of progress in terms of side effects over the decades. So there's much less side effects than there used to be, especially for antidepressants. Some things, antipsychotics have not changed as much. Those are largely sort of sedative, as are certain kinds of anxiety drugs, like you've heard about benzos. Yeah, exactly, Arlette. It's kind of, it's a bit of the correlation, not causation problem, right? Where, to my mind at least, it seems likely that what people were doing is mistaking the fact that people with depression were showing low levels of serotonin and thinking that's the cause, when it's kind of another effect. So there's all these classes of drugs that got developed and kept being developed for a couple of reasons, right? At least one of them is like big pharma, right? Capitalism and the increasing marketability. But also, we keep using them and we keep developing them because in some way, they're working. They're not working quite like we thought they would, right? If they did, then everybody taking antidepressants would be cured. We wouldn't see people who are resistant to medication. So it's not 100% true. But across the board, there are a number of people, right, who still report some benefits, who say, like, doesn't seem like maybe it's treating the whole thing, but I'm sleeping a little better or I'm eating a little better, and that's worth it. So, in fact, most people who are on psychiatric medication have a kind of complicated relationship with it. That it's not like, wow, this is easily curing me, but still find it useful. So I'm going to show you a very short advertisement from Zoloft, which is one of the SSRIs, which is like second and third generation of antidepressants. So this started airing in the early 2000s as a kind of way to help people understand both what depression was and how medication works. So I'd like you to just watch it, think about the message it's sending, the kind of emotions, and notice what they're doing with the neurotransmitters.
You know when you feel the weight of sadness. You may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious. Whatever you do, you feel lonely and don't enjoy the things you once loved. Things just don't feel like they used to. These are some symptoms of depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. Prescription Zoloft works to correct this imbalance. You just shouldn't have to feel this way anymore. Only your doctor can diagnose depression. Zoloft is not for everyone. People taking MAOIs or Pimozide shouldn't take Zoloft. Side effects may include dry mouth, insomnia, sexual side effects, diarrhea, nausea, and sleepiness. Zoloft is not habit-forming. Talk to your doctor about Zoloft, the #1 prescribed brand of its kind. Zoloft. When you know more about what's wrong, you can help make it right.
One of the things I wanted you to notice with that is, right, that little cartoon picture of the neurotransmitters going back and forth across. So that's an illustration, right, of the chemical imbalance theory of the brain and what happens there. This is the kind of commercial that was on, constantly in my childhood and teens, and is really interesting. So we'll just have a couple more slides on the chemical imbalance theory and medication, and then I'll talk with you about the final essay instructions. But I'm also happy to stay on if people have more questions tonight, and to answer more questions next week or by Mayo. Let's see. So in brief, right, if mental illnesses were only and just chemical imbalances, we would not see people who can't find a medication that works. We would see complete kind of remission of symptoms. So it's important to keep in mind, right, that chemical imbalances, they may be part of the story, but they're definitely not the only cause. And that what we're doing when we engage in using psychopharmaceuticals and medication is to treat symptoms first and foremost. Not that it means it's bad, it's a treatment of symptoms. And as I said, as Arlette picked out in the chat accurately, a lot of this talk of chemical imbalance theory, or if you just see a kind of, I put this image, right? You search like depression brain scan, you could find some images. That can tell you about the brains of people with depression, but it doesn't show you the cause of depression, right? It just shows you something that is happening at the same time. So that is my spiel on the chemical imbalance theory. Next time we're going to talk about therapy. I will skip these for now. Okay. So response number 6, I have uploaded the instructions, and you have a short university newspaper opinion piece to read. Everything about the format as the other responses is the same. So this is actually an opinion piece about how we use the word crazy, which is not something we've so far explicitly discussed in class, but it definitely is one that is relevant to this question of the terminology of madness. So you don't get a choice on this one, but it's a really easy short text. I wanted to make sure it was an easy one because the final exam instructions have also been posted. So I'm going to let me just get out of the PowerPoint for a second, show you the instructions document, which is up on Leia. So it's due a little over 2 weeks, well, 2 weeks from tonight, on Leia in PDF or doc. It must be between 700 and 900 words. So it's about twice as long as the responses that we've been writing. The essay must be in your own words, but you should cite from class materials. So whether that be a direct quotation or a reference to an example of the authors that we've read and the texts that we've used. So there are 3 topics you can choose from, and within each topic, you kind of also have an option. Basically, the first question is about treatment, right? So how ought we to treat people who
Emily,
are undergoing...
The document for the
Sorry?
final essay was not posted. So it's like a
Oh, shoot.
Hey, just read the instructions, but it wasn't. There's no document there.
Okay, well, I will upload it right now because you are getting assigned it in the class, and then you will be able to read it. So thank you. So the first question is, okay, I will describe them to you and then I will upload it so that you can read on my screen. The first question is about treatment. So out of all the worldviews we've studied in class, I want you to present one model of treatment related to its kind of social conditions, its position in history and geography. Then I want you to present a different treatment model, which goes against the first, right? Which says, no, that's not the way we ought to treat people, from another of the worldviews. And then I want you to reflect upon both and present your opinion. So it might be that, like, yes, I really think that the first treatment model is right and the second one is wrong. You might think the second one is right and the first one is wrong. You might think they're both wrong, in which case you should say why. You might think that a combination might be useful, in which case you should say why. So I've given you a list here. So you can pick any 2 out of here. If there's something you see, or there's something we've studied in our readings which is not in any of these lists, you can ask me and I can approve it. But like, say you want to compare psychoanalysis, right, the talk and cure part, to psychopharmaceuticals or the use of medication.
You are not sharing,
so then you would...
You are not sharing the screen with the document.
It appears that I am, but let me see. I can stop and do it again. Let's see. That helps.
Now, yes.
So, yeah. So you can pick any of these 2. And then in this case, you just like follow these instructions, right? So present one model, present another model, present your opinion, with the short introduction and conclusion. You can use multiple, you ought to use multiple because you will be talking about more than one worldview. Okay. The second option, same thing, except for instead of about treatment, no, you should only pick 2. If you want to try write about like 4, then you're not writing about them in enough depth. That's okay, questions are good. So the second option you can choose for the essay is to write about the causes. So all the worldviews we've looked at, right, they've also had different kinds of explanations for what the cause or origin of mental and emotional distress are. And this is going to have the exact same structure. So ideally, right, this will mean that you can make it really clear how everything relates. So you can pick any two of these causes of mental or emotional distress. And again, I'm looking for you to present one, present the other, and be able to assess, right, like what are the problems with one view or the strengths of the other view, and what you think about both of them. And then the third question is the question about naming or terminology. So all the worldviews that we've looked at, right, have had different ways of referring to, naming, or calling mental and emotional distress. So I've listed the options here, and you also have the option of writing about the newspaper piece for the response this week, which discusses the use of the word crazy. And again, it's got the same structure, right? So what one worldview says about how we should name people in emotional distress, what the other worldview says. What do you think about it? You like both of them, you like neither of them, you like one. And so throughout, right, you should be explaining not only what the like simple answer is, like, well, let's call it mental illness, but what does it carry with it, right? So how is that related to health or normalcy, right? If we're calling it actually a matter of unconscious neuroses, you'll need to explain what is the role of the unconscious, right? Why it would be important to say that this disturbance is unconscious. If you want to talk about problems in living or disturbances in Lang's term, right, you'll need to talk about why the language matters there. And then one thing, so I put this is a kind of rejoinder to the writing workshop we did last week. If you don't know a structure, or if you read that and you're not sure, okay, how am I going to organize the paragraphs? Please use this example structure. It will make it easier on you, and it will make it easier on me. If you're like, oh no, I know how to do a very advanced refined structure, that's an option. So if you give me a short introduction, which tells me about what your paper is going to do, right? A little bit of context, but short. Give me a first proposed answer to the question at hand, right? Whichever question you pick. Give me a second disagreeing answer to the same question. And then give me your own synthesis or understanding and a brief conclusion. So I will upload that right now. Attach that to the assignment Dropbox. Sorry. On this one, yeah, you would have 5 paragraphs in total. I know that there are many people who hate the 5-paragraph essay once you get to university, but it is a very helpful model if you are having trouble finding a structure in the first place. So that being said, if you want to follow another structure, you can at your own risk and knowing what your own strengths are. Are there other questions about the final essay? So it does have to be due on the last day of class. If there are people with accommodations and extensions, I can look into what is the latest that I can get your grades back from this. But ideally, you should start thinking about it because your response is easier to read this week. I would spend some time at least picking, right, which of the big 3 questions you want to answer. And then thinking and being strategic. So if you know that you really understood the anti-psychiatry unit, but you didn't understand the medieval madness unit at all, then don't write about the medieval stuff, write about anti-psychiatry, right? There's choices here to make it flexible so that you can show off as much as possible what you know. Okay. Are there, it's like the formatting I showed you last week, baby MLA would be good. Someone's asking about formatting. So, okay. What you need to do this week is these things. You need to, oops, you need to read this short piece about using the word crazy. No, I didn't correct the last ones yet. It's been 1 week. I will have them corrected next week. And do response 6. Read a short piece on neoliberalism for next week. It's like 5 pages. And start working on the final essay. If the reading is really hard, leave it aside and work on your essay instead. That's more important. About the Moncrief, the you have to submit about it. Okay, any other questions either about the final essay? I'm glad that everybody seemed to find the presentation really informative, and I'm glad you all had questions. So I have recorded this second part of our class and I will upload that. Okay. And as I said, you can also shoot me questions about the final essay on Myo. If you have more extensive questions, we can meet. And of course, I'm open to it next week. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. You are free to go if you wish. You're free to hang around if you wish. Thanks.